You have an entire network of left-wing violent extremists in our state who have operated out in the open shamelessly for years and years and years, and we act as if it does not exist. This task force is a farce. It's not about fighting domestic violent extremism. It is about fighting against conservatives. It's about fighting against anyone who dares dissent from the government or the prevailing political narrative, who dares to question what's going on. So this whole thing has been in the works for several years now. Basically, in 2022, the state legislature told Bob Ferguson, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who's going to be our next governor, hey, you need to do a study on all this right-wing hatred, domestic violent extremism going on, and make recommendations to the legislature about what we should do to deal with it. So in late 2022, the Attorney General's office put out its study. The recommendation was the legislature should create a 2-year commission with the broad goal of establishing a comprehensive public health and community-based framework for responding to domestic violent extremism. Ah, yes. What else would you follow a study up with other than a task force? That is government bureaucracy at its finest. So when this happened in 2022, and when the Attorney General's office, who'd been fighting with the previous Trump administration and who's obviously very ideologically to the left, did a study and put this to the legislature, it became very clear that this was going to probably be a domestic violent extremism task force focused strictly on conservative white men and no other form of domestic violent extremism. A PowerPoint presentation that was put together by the ADL, but back in 2022, when the legislature was discussing what to do, was actually shown to the legislature by a representative from the Attorney General's office. I'm just going to go through it because it made it clear. Again, this is back in 2022. We knew exactly what was going to happen here. Let's see a couple of the slides, shall we? History of white supremacy in Washington. Okay, white supremacy's been a thing. I'm not saying white supremacy isn't still a thing. If you're talking about domestic violent extremism, absolutely you should talk about that. It went into Washington and the Pacific Northwest having a significant history of white supremacy. Oh yeah, even having the old KKKs and hoods there. Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about white supremacy. 100%. We're not leaving any sort of domestic violent extremism out, except that's all they talked about in this presentation. White supremacist networks in Washington today. Went on to, oh yeah, you've got the group there with the old Nazi salute. Oh my God, they're holding signs that say it's okay to be white. What? Domestic violent extremist. It is not okay to be white. Let's see. 'Cause surely they're going to get to some other sort of extremism here. Oh, no, not yet. White supremacist propaganda. Oh, it's got somebody holding up one of those okay signs, which is not okay because that actually means white power. Increased targeting of the LGBTQ community. Oh, and it has people holding a sign that has the word groomers crossed out of it. And of course, the white power salute again. And then this was the one that really got a lot of attention, understandably, from us and the right when this presentation was presented in Olympia in 2022. Conspiratorial narratives motivating extremists boosted by the mainstream. Okay, let's see if any of these apply to you, shall we? Election fraud narratives? Anti-critical race theory narratives? Oh. Anti-LGBTQ plus grooming narratives? Oh. Here's the real kicker. Now you're all on the list. Anti-mask and anti-vaccine narratives. And all of those things have led to increased threats against election officials, medical professionals, and school board members, protests and disruptions at school board meetings, pride events, and drag queen story hours. So it was crystal clear in 2022 that this study done by the Attorney General's office, that the subsequent recommendation to create a 2-year domestic violent extremism task force that got funding from the legislature to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars was going to be about Republicans, conservatives, white people bad, and was going to ignore a lot of the other much more obvious, much more active much more vocal aspects of domestic violent extremism that have been happening in this state with regularity since I moved here 15 years ago. But I thought, okay, well, 2022, that's a couple years ago. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and they're going to have their task force meetings. There's several dozen members of the task force. Surely there is some robust representation on this task force that is going to talk about some things like the dreaded A word, Antifa, right? Some of the left-wing violence that's happening. Well, the task force met and they got started hearing from Democratic State Senator Bill Ramos, who now is senator, was a representative, who talked about his reasoning for pushing for this task force so hard.
Just a little background on how it got to here. A few years ago, I got involved with a number of people in the community asking for protection from police officers and sheriff's departments and so forth, and they weren't being responded to.
Yeah, so okay, starting it off on a rocky foot. That this domestic violent extremism task force, according to this state lawmaker, was born out of the fears he was hearing from people in the community that they needed to be protected from the police. But okay, again, there's dozens of members on this task force, so I thought, let me just hear them out, and surely someone is going to bring up the most obvious, most frequent form of domestic violent extremism that we deal with in Washington state, which is left-wing, anarchist, Antifa violence. So let's just listen to a few of the task force members introducing themselves, shall we?
Good morning. My name is Katrina Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Black Lives Matter Seattle-King County. We are a statewide agency. My pronouns are she, her. I'm here looking for innovative ways and tangible ways to protect our community when law enforcement isn't the go-to people.
My name is Amasai Cheke. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with Utopia Washington, a queer and trans Pacific Islander-led organization. Yes, I'm excited to be here and also to learn in ways to strengthen social justice movement. Thank you.
I'm Leslie Cushman. I'm here on behalf of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. I use she, her pronouns. We're worried about the mainstreaming of extremism. We're worried about law enforcement affiliation with extremism and how this impacts community safety and well-being and how it impacts the rule of law.
Good morning, everyone. Luis Moscoso. I'm a former state representative on the Public Safety Committee 11 years ago, where I first tried to bring up this issue of looking into militia movements and other activities. I have had direct experience with militia people going back over 30 years in Snohomish County, where I used to live.
Hi, my name's Mary Hall. I'm the Thurston County Auditor. I look forward to serving on this committee. I think we really need to take a deep dive into how we protect our communities in this incoming administration, and not only the community, but election workers. I think there's a lot of underlying tension.
My name is Juan Perales. I'm president of Unidos of Snohomish County, who has been addressing for the last 3-4 years now domestic terrorism and police accountability. And now that we have Trump in power, this issue has become even more important. So I think it's going to take collective action on the part of us to address the oncoming fear of this new administration.
Antifa wasn't mentioned once. Neither was, look, if you don't like the phrase Antifa, you think it's a figment of our imagination, neither was anarchists. Neither was the people who routinely bash in windows at Amazon Go stores and Starbucks and any other business that they believe has wronged them. The people who just defaced the home and car of the UW president. The people who defaced the home of Amazon CEO Andy Jassy. The people who blocked I-5 for 5 hours. The people who blocked access to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the people who took over the quad at the University of Washington, scrawling anti-Semitism all over the walls of old buildings, the people who took over 6 square blocks of the city and handed out semi-automatic weapons of war out of the trunk of their car. I thought those were bad. I guess not so bad if you're protesting against the police. Need I go on? The people who lit police cars on fire in downtown Seattle, the people who mobbed my crew in the summer of 2020, the people who led the Occupy movement and had frequent clashes with police. Need I go on? The people who firebombed the police union building. Need I go on? The people who firebombed a ballot drop box. Need I go on? This task force is designed to increase domestic violent extremism by giving cover to the people who perpetrate it the most. And it's scary stuff. And there's a lot of us watching who I think are going to land on the list, whatever list they're compiling of domestic violent extremists. Again, if I go back to that 2022 PowerPoint, and one of those last slides I showed you, conspiratorial narratives motivating extremists boosted by the mainstream. So now you have, again, this in a presentation presented to the legislature by the Attorney General's office, which is in charge of this domestic violent extremist task force. In fact, the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, who's now going to be our governor, was responsible for appointing the people who were going to be on the task force. And he now has this whole segment of his transition team that is specifically to fight against Project 2025 and all of its extremism that he says that Donald Trump is going to perpetrate. And at the same time, he's also behind the hate crime hotline that he's set up. Who do you think is going to use the hate crime hotline? It's going to be liberals on Capitol Hill who suffer from microaggressions. But again, I go back to that PowerPoint. I guess I'm a domestic violent extremist. So just put me on the list already. Look, Brandi, Kruse. You have an entire network of left-wing violent extremists in our state who have operated out in the open shamelessly for years and years and years. And not one iota of this first task force meeting was dedicated to talking about them. That's insane stuff. And it shows you how dangerous Bob Ferguson and his ilk are. It's not about fighting domestic violent extremism. It is about fighting against conservatives. It's about fighting against anyone who dares dissent from the government or the prevailing political narrative, who dares to question what's going on. Well, I got news for you. If you do that, you better be ready to land on the list of the Domestic Violent Extremism Task Force. You know, there are some law enforcement officers who were also on that task force who introduced themselves. It was very just mundane, like, hello, here's who I am, here's what I belong to, just here to see how we can help. Every single one of them should have logged off that meeting. Every single one of them should resign from the task force today because they know it's a farce. Half of those people who introduced themselves were anti-police activists, police abolition activists. Black Lives Matter? The head of Black Lives Matter for Seattle King County? An organization nationally that has proven to be an utter scam? An organization whose adherents have committed acts of violence and vandalism, did for years on end, including against the police? I interviewed police officers after the summer of 2020, one who had their leg blown apart by something thrown at them. And again, an entire police precinct. Every officer, every law enforcement agency that is on that task force should be rethinking its participation today. You should be resigning from it today. And I know that you're like, well, politically, he's going to be the governor. We can't resign from it. What are we going to do? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And if you don't resign from it today, you're just contributing to that narrative. You're supporting that narrative. And you're supporting them ignoring the people who have assaulted officers, attacked officers, vilified officers, called for officers and law enforcement to be disbanded and defunded. Why would you ever want to be a part of that? So in all seriousness, I can sit here and God knows, Nicole knows, I was laughing my ass off this morning at all these people introducing themselves and their unhinged rhetoric and, oh my God, we got to protect ourselves from Donald Trump. Well, they just absolutely hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil about the left-wing violence here. Laughing my ass off. Some of it was all the obvious women who were introducing themselves with she, her pronouns. Again, I'm on the task force list, don't worry. No, I can just say whatever I want because I'm already on the list. So I was laughing, but it's serious stuff. It's deadly serious. And again, you combine that with the hate crime hotline, which is just going to be used to inflate hate crime numbers. So you create a hotline, like there was already a hate crime hotline. It's called 911. If you're the victim of a crime, whatever crime that is, you can call 911. But that's not what this is. This is separate. And this has no sort of investigatory threshold. So if you feel like you were the victim of a hate crime, you can call the hate crime hotline and report it. And they'll mark it down and they'll listen to your story. They're not going to investigate it to see if it actually happened. They're not going to investigate it or weigh it against the law to see if you were actually the victim of a hate crime or if you were the victim of a microaggression. And so what is that going to do? Well, it's going to inflate the hate crime numbers. So as you inflate the hate crime numbers, then they use that to justify their domestic violent extremism task force. They use that to justify giving that task force more money, more time, more power to create laws that will paint us, anyone who dissents, as domestic violent extremists. And I'm sorry, and I hate to get my tin hat on, but now you've got law enforcement officers participating in that charade. Are you going to participate in whatever they decide to do with those of us who are labeled domestic violent extremists? Are you willing to show up at my door and arrest me and put me in jail? Genuine question to the men and women of law enforcement who I have defended vigorously on this show and in my previous career for years and years and years. How long and to what extent are you going to be used as a pawn by the Ferguson administration? How long are you willing to play along? Is it just for the task force? Is it just for the recommendations of the task force? Are you just going to attend a few meetings? Or when that task force takes these extreme ideas and turns it into action, are you willing to be the one who acts on it? Are you willing to go arrest Washingtonians who, in the eyes of these unhinged people, are domestic violent extremists? Ask yourself that genuinely, because you might be faced with that question. You might be faced with that decision. And if the decision is you're not going to do what they tell you to do, are you willing to sacrifice your job and your career? I'm not being hyperbolic. That's where this is heading. If you don't see it, I don't know how to wake you up to it. This is wild stuff. And again, we can simplify it by just saying, oh, they're ignoring left-wing extremism. It's more than that. They are manufacturing what it means to be an extremist.